Welcome, listeners, viewers, and online guests to the next session in our series of Safe to Trade conversations. I'm your host, Kelvin Wood, and as the certification body manager at Safe to Trade, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the session this morning. We're continuing our conversations that are going to provide you with all the information you need to know about the scheme. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and thank you to those joining us live online this morning in our virtual forum. After our short conversation today, you will have the opportunity to ask our guests some questions. So if you think that's you and you've got a question to ask, just pop your question into the comments pane and we will get through as many of those at the end of the session, time permitting. So speaking of guests, today I'm joined by some very special people. We have Jane Cull, the Safe to Trade Scheme Manager. We have Geoffrey Podger, who's the Chair of the Independent Governance Board at Safe to Trade. And we have Selvarani Elahi, who is the Impartiality Committee Chair at Shield Safety Group. So good morning to you all. Thank you all for joining today.
Hi, Kelvin.
Let's start with some introductions. So Geoffrey, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement with Safe to Trade.
Okay, well, I'm Geoffrey Podger. I'm a sort of semi-retired regulator, but I should say at the outset that I'm in no way a manic regulator. I'm very much a believer in proportionate regulation. And I used to run the Food Standards Agency, the European Food Safety Authority. I was at HSE for a long time, and I'm currently engaged in the regulation of the Channel Tunnel. But apart from all that, I have had a long involvement actually with Safe to Trade since it was first conceived, and have been one of the people who've been discussing how to run the scheme. And now, as we'll come on to, I actually look after the Independent Governance Board. So that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. And Selvarani, welcome to the session. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement with Safe to Trade.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me okay now? Great. Thanks, Kelvin, and morning, everybody. My name's Selvarani Elahi. I'm the UK Deputy Government Chemist. I work at a company called LGC, which is a measurements and testing solutions provider with the mission of science for a safe world. I'm also the Executive Director of a network called the Food Authenticity Network that provides tools to enable food business operators to prevent food fraud risks. I've been involved with Safe to Trade for over 2 years now. I served on the governance board under Geoffrey for over 2 years, and I now have the pleasure of chairing the Impartiality Committee for the certification body, and look forward to working with the scheme.
Wonderful. Thank you, Selvarani. We are experiencing a little bit of feedback, so I'm going to be trying my best to manage mutes for people so it doesn't. Okay, finally, Jane, hi. Please introduce yourself and your role with Safe to Trade.
Thanks, Kelvin. My name's Jane Cull. I'm the scheme manager for Safe to Trade. So I basically manage the scheme on a day-to-day basis on behalf of all of our governance committees. So that's the Independent Governance Board that Geoffrey chairs, and then we have a Technical Standards Committee that Alec Kyriakides chairs, and a Stakeholder Engagement Forum that John Barnes chairs. And as you know, Kelvin, the scheme is run completely separately from the certification body, which you manage. So we're kind of on opposite ends of the, either side of the scheme, basically, in that sense. And as you know, Safe to Trade is a certification scheme for food safety and health and safety in the hospitality sector. My background's in project management, not environmental health, so I'm very reliant on the experts around me. I've actually got a degree in engineering. And my involvement in Safe to Trade started about 5 or 6 years ago with some very early pilots and feasibility studies that we did with regulators that moved on to a scheme where we, during the COVID period, pandemic, we managed a certification scheme for hospitality businesses and COVID-19, and then that's moved on to the scheme that we have today. So that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. And as always, I'm your host, Kelvin. I'm a environmental health practitioner with experience in public and private sector, as well as former hospitality manager in catering hotels and restaurants. So my role at Safe to Trade is to make sure all certification decisions are undertaken both impartially and in accordance with the protocol laid down by the IGB. So very much feel like I've got my bosses watching me today. So this is going to be a very interesting session all around. Wonderful. Okay, so as I just said, we're introducing the topic today. We are going to be looking specifically at how Safe to Trade is run and operated with regard to focus on impartiality and following the Safe to Trade protocol itself. So let's start off with yourself, Geoffrey. We spoke earlier about the Independence Governance Board. Let's tell us a little bit about the functions of the board and what you guys get up to.
Basically looks after the scheme as a whole. I think that's the way to look at it. As you'll already have gathered from what Kelvin said, we actually managed to push quite a bit of the work off onto other people, and you'll hear a bit more about that later on. But actually what we do look at is how the scheme is developing, what people like the Technical Standards Committee and the Stakeholder Engagement Forum are doing. We actually look to see how the scheme is actually progressing, and that's progressing not only in our view, but also in the view of the people who are using it, and of course the end customers, the consumers. So we're looking at it in the round, if you like, and we're all the time thinking, where is the scheme going? Do we need to do more of this? Do we need to do that? Are there complaints about anything? If there are, is it being dealt with? Are there things we need to do? But I have to say, actually, that certainly so far, the scheme seems to have been very well received. We've had very few complaints to deal with. And where there have been problems, they've usually been things like, for example, businesses changing ownership and so on. They have not been things which give us cause for great concern. So, as I say, what we're doing basically is keeping the scheme as a whole under review, both as to how it's performing currently, but also with an eye to the future on what changes we might make, if any, and how we could develop the scheme more generally. So that's us.
Wonderful. And how are you guys kept up to date about the happenings of the scheme? What kind of reporting do you receive?
Well, we receive quite voluminous reports, actually, 4 times a year. And we also get, obviously, emails letting us know of developments as they go along. So we don't just sit in splendid isolation somewhere. We are actually involved in looking at what's going on and how the scheme is going.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Geoffrey. Let's bring in Jane. And I'm going to mute you. Jane, so we were talking there about the protocol itself. Tell us a little bit about the protocol and your role to kind of, dare I say, carry through some of the actions from the IGB.
Yeah, okay. So the protocol is a document that explains how the scheme operates. It's about 50 pages long, so it's pretty detailed, actually. And fundamentally, that document is explaining the rules and the governance that's required so that the scheme can be trusted by our stakeholders. So our stakeholders are obviously food businesses, they're members of the public who go and eat out in these restaurants or, stay in these hotels, regulators as well, and of course, certification bodies. So they're all stakeholders that have an interest in the scheme, and what we want is to make sure the scheme can be trusted. It might help, actually, Kelvin, I think you've got an image of how the scheme is structured in terms of its relationship. So it might be worth me just going through that really quickly.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's not massively large, the image, Jane. So if you wouldn't mind just talking through for the benefit of people who are either just listening in without watching or haven't brought their magnifying glass.
Okay, yeah, sorry, it's a bit small, isn't it? So we've got the scheme, which we've already mentioned about, operates separately from the certification body. In fact, Safe to Trade as a scheme wants to have many certification bodies involved as the scheme grows, because obviously there's hundreds of thousands of hospitality businesses in the UK, and it's very unlikely that one certification body would be able to cover all of those at once. So the scheme will have relationships with certification bodies, and the certification bodies are the ones that have the relationships with food business operators. So the certification bodies carry out the audits to measure the food business's compliance against the safe to trade standard, and they provide recognition then to the food business operator when they achieve the standard by issuing them safe to trade marketing material and things like that. The certification body also maintains their own register of all the businesses that have been approved against the standard, and that register can be accessed by members of the public, so consumers, who can see which businesses are approved, and they can also provide consumer feedback on the register on whether things are going well or whether things need to improve, and all that information actually ultimately gets fed back via data links to the scheme owner, so that we can maintain oversight of the performance of the food business operators that are on the scheme. We also want to keep a relationship with regulators going, so regulators can access a feed of businesses that are approved on the register. So that will inform them which businesses are generally compliant with, for example, food safety legislation. And the scheme as well also has a relationship with the regulator, where we can pull in all the anonymised non-conformance data from all the certification bodies from these audits, and then share that with regulators and any other stakeholders that are interested, to provide them with anonymised data insights. So it's maybe a bit more complex than the way other schemes may operate, but it's all around trying to make sure that the scheme is appropriately governed and can be trusted. So if I just go back to the protocol then, the protocol contains rules about, for example, the nature of audits that are conducted, the competency of auditors, the qualifications of the auditors, how the certifications body should operate so that they're acting impartially. It talks about how the public register should be managed to make sure that it's maintained, that it's up to date and it stays accurate and it's accessible to people. The protocol also explains what data can be shared with regulators and the public, so that we're not contravening, for example, confidentiality arrangements or data protection arrangements that the certification bodies may have already in place with food business operators. And then finally, the protocol also covers all the terms of reference, so the frequency of meetings, the number of members, how voting rights are, what the voting rights are for each of the governance committees.
Wonderful.
It's a pretty expensive
It does. Thank you. Let's bring Geoffrey back in as well. You mentioned, Jane, about the information from the scheme being shared with regulators. Sorry to put this on you, but Geoffrey, you may be able to help as well. How is it envisaged that regulators would use the information that is shared from Safe to Trade?
Well, we're not regulators, so ultimately it's down to them. But what we're all assuming, and I think regulators who've been, as Jane was saying, involved in developing the scheme have said to us, is it really enables them to prioritise whom they should inspect with their limited resources. So we would certainly hope that regulators who can see from the register that actually a business is meeting all the requirements of the scheme are then not going to be prioritised for inspection. But I stress, we hope that, you could never be sure. But I think it's very likely regulators are pressed at the moment, they're losing staff, and they themselves, I think, are looking for ways of how to better prioritise where they concentrate their activity. So it was thought through quite carefully, I think. We can't act as the regulator, and equally, they can't act as we are in Safe to Trade. But what they can do is get information out of the register, which should enable them both to see who's doing all the things they need to do, and also, I'm afraid, the few cases we hope where people have actually left the scheme for one reason or another, or are being rather carefully reviewed. So that's how it works.
Wonderful. Thank you, Geoffrey. And Jen, you were mentioning about scheme eligibility. Is that for the food business operators to be eligible to be Safe to Trade, or are we talking from a certification body eligibility to deliver Safe to Trade? Are we able to expand a bit there?
So in terms of there's different criteria really. So for food business operators to be eligible for the scheme, I mean any food business operator can enrol on the scheme. In the UK, they must have an FHRS rating or be awaiting their assessment for their FHRS rating. But there's, it's very broad in terms of what type of business or what businesses can enrol. In terms of certification bodies, we're stating in the protocol that they should have 17,065 accreditation, but we're actually going through scheme eligibility with that with UCAS at the moment. So that's on the assumption that all goes through fine, which we expect. If a certification body hasn't got 17,065 accreditation, they can still participate in the scheme, but they've basically got a 12-month period over which they need to become accredited.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. And just going back to the food hygiene rating element, what you mentioned about eligibility, it's dare I say, a positive food hygiene rating, isn't it? It's a 3 or above in England and Wales, or a pass in Scotland.
So it's obviously any business can apply, can set up their agreement with their certification body, but the standard itself, so the technical standard against which they're approved, like you said, Kelvin, says they must have a 3 or higher. So if they've got a rating. So yeah, so they can apply, but they wouldn't actually pass the standard if they had an FHRS of 1 or
Correct. Yeah. I can absolutely confirm that is one of my daily tasks before issuing approval. Trying to find people on the register is obviously the hardest bit sometimes. Geoffrey, you mentioned about businesses that may expire from the scheme. That could be as a result of when the contract lapses with the certification body, so they no longer wish for us to come out and audit them moving forward. But people can expire from the scheme from not closing non-conformances within a pre-agreed window, or it could be as a result of a new food hygiene rating, which is not a 3 or above, dare we say, and that will all trigger certification decisions again, won't it?
Yes, I'm not terribly keen on the verb expire. It implies we're going to have loads of dead bodies all over the place. I don't think that's the case at all. But inevitably, there will be people who will decide not to renew, and there'll be people who, I'm afraid, on the basis of their performance, we decide not to want. And the register will make clear in various categories precisely what has happened. But there is a great advantage in being on the register, in that it enables you to display to your customers that you're a safe to trade organization. And it means that, you're being very open and frank, but you're equally, to be honest, boasting a bit about what you've achieved. And I think that's quite right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Jane, you mentioned there's a number of SLAs contained within the protocol. As certification body manager, ultimately they're my rules that I have to adhere to. Are there any kind of highlights that you're able to share in terms of SLAs, just to provide confidence that the certification bodies need to operate in a particular manner?
Yeah, so for example, if a food business operator is a new entrant into the scheme, and they've not yet made it onto the register because they're new on the scheme and they're going through all the kind of onboarding processes. Once they've had their audit, they've got 90 days to close off non-conformances. Once they're then on the register and they're kind of in the public domain, then, so to speak, in terms of safe to trade, on their subsequent audits, they've got 30 days to close non-conformances. In terms of other timescales, I know, Kelvin, for example, once non-conformances have been closed, they must be verified by the certification body to verify that closure status is accurate. And the certification body has tight timescales to do that. But once that's been verified, I think, Kelvin, the certification decision has to be made within 24 hours.
That's correct.
So that the register is populated as soon as possible. And overall, that timescale of 30 days is there so that businesses can get onto the register as soon as possible. It aligns with timescales that we would expect other schemes operate against. For example, what we would expect in terms of, if you think of an FHRS rating and when that gets made public. So the logic behind those timescales is set based on other kind of information schemes that we've looked at.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know in a previous session several months ago, we had Stuart Wiggins attend, who's the operations director at the Shield Safety Group, who manages the audit team, basically, so responsible for the competency of that team. There's a huge reliance on the competency criteria and an EHP register for safe to trade to make sure it's delivered impartially in accordance to the protocol and to other standards as well. Is there anything we can share about the EH register and the competency requirements laid out in the protocol?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So the auditor qualifications and competency requirements align with, for example, the Food Law Code of Practice in terms of what qualifications and competency officers would need to be able to undertake food hygiene ratings. So we align with that, and then the auditors also are required to complete safe to trade training in the standards. They're required to complete impartiality training, and obviously they have to complete training in terms of the fundamentals of audits. And then following all that, if they've passed all those, all that training, got the right qualifications, and they've demonstrated competency, they have a witnessed audit that's carried out, which they also must pass before they're allowed to do audits unsupervised. Following that, the certification body has to have quality assurance systems in place to monitor the quality of the audit reports. They must be doing witnessed audits of the auditors on a periodic basis to make sure that they're still maintaining their competencies. And the scheme itself as well also has an integrity programme where the scheme will go and also carry out witnessed audits to check that the information that the certification body is providing about the quality and competency of the audits that are taken, or the auditors and the audits that are taking place, is robust.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's sorry, Geoffrey, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, speaking personally, I've never come across a scheme which is actually so thorough and so good at actually looking at the quality of its auditors. And indeed, let me say, in the main, the quality is absolutely held up. But where there be one or two cases of doubt, I have been impressed by the extent to which these have been identified and action taken. So I think that's really helpful from a business point of view to know that actually people who, in inverted commas, turn up to the inspection are actually going to be people who are well qualified and actually are going to be good on the day.
Wonderful, thank you. And my specific role with the certification body is I sit in parallel with the audit management team. So I am a little bit of occasional voice of doom to say, we need to, that auditor can't be used for a safe to trade because of certain reasons. And part of my role is constant updates to the audit team to make sure anything new from the scheme, from the IGB, from the Technical Standards Committee is cascaded out so that people are constantly up to date and informed about the scheme, no matter which stakeholder group they find themselves in. Thank you. Jane, let's get back to some of the specifics of the protocol here. We want to talk about the consistency approach in the certification process. So what do we want to tell the viewers and listeners there? Thanks, Geoffrey.
Yeah, so I can talk a bit more about what the protocol contains. So it contains, for example, information about the nature of audits. So audits are unannounced. There are some exceptions to that. So the protocol actually states what those exceptions are. So, for example, if a food business operator is airside at an airport, then because of the security constraints where they have to have say 24 hours notice before they're allowed to enter that area, then those audits, as an example, is an exception where an announced audit would be allowed. But in general, audits are unannounced, and that aligns with the guidance that's provided in the Codex VTPA guidelines, for example. So that's where that's come from. The audit durations obviously vary dependent on the type of premises that's being audited. So if it's, for example, a kiosk in a supermarket, that would be a 2-hour audit. But if it was a small cafe or a standard cafe or restaurant, that would typically be a 4-hour audit. And then anything that's more complex that might have multiple kitchens would typically be a day or longer. So that's all defined very clearly in the protocol. Obviously the scheme as well owns the standard against which businesses are audited. So the standard contains over, I think, about 80 clauses that specify what the requirements are in terms of being approved, and they're detailed clauses, and each clause is split into two parts. So it's split into what is a legal requirement against that clause and what is best practice. And for a business to be approved on the register and be displayed on the register, they have to meet the legislative requirements of the standard. They then have a choice whether or not they want to meet any best practice requirements, because obviously some businesses may have reasons not to want to achieve the particular best practice that we've noted in the standard, although that is based on kind of industry best practice. They may have very legitimate reasons for not wanting to achieve some of those. But also it means by differentiating between best practices and legal requirements, it means when we provide data to regulators, for example, or non-conformance insight data, that we can clearly differentiate between what's a legal requirement and what's not. And that's really, really useful for regulators and local authorities to have that. So that's obviously having a robust standard that's very clearly defined, obviously has an obvious impact on the consistency of the audits that take place.
Wonderful. And we went through the exercise of the legislative mapping, didn't we, against all of the standard clauses for the requirements, and then obviously the best practices. A lot of the customers of Safe to Trade are multi-location businesses who will have a very defined food safety management system, health and safety policy. So sometimes some of those best practices don't fit with the policy control measures, but obviously all of the requirements would. And if they don't, then obviously that's a reason to update policies, etc. Yeah,
definitely. There's a ton of stuff in the protocol that's all around making sure the audits are consistent. I mean, obviously as well, when the certification body creates the audit set again that they're going to use against the standard, that has to obviously align against the standard. And I know, Kelvin, because we've been working on this together, I've seen the information that's come back from the certification body. We check very carefully that the audit set maps in detail against the standard requirements and the relevant legislation. And then obviously the standard itself has assured advice. It's signed off by the Technical Standards Committee within the scheme as well. So there's a lot of oversight in terms of the standard itself.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's just bring Geoffrey back in there. We mentioned about the Technical Standards Committee, and they provide ownership and maintain oversight of the contents of the standard. We've had Alec Kyriakides on a previous session, but maybe just as a reminder, can we go through maybe some of the responsibilities of the Technical Standards Committee while we're in relation to the standard?
Yeah, I mean, they have quite a complex task, and you wouldn't find a better person than Alec to actually be in charge of it, because they've got to actually check what we're requiring against the standards in the UK, against international standards. Then, as Jane was saying, there are also issues of best practice. So it is producing pretty comprehensive, pretty good documents, but I would stress they are actually usable. I can't help feeling there's a danger we're going to put everybody off simply because we have this large amount of documentation. I think it's very important, if I might go back to what we were saying, to say, for example, that the protocol, actually, and of which Jane is the author, so we're not going to spare her blushes, is actually a very readable document. And similarly, of course, the technical standards, by definition, look like technical standards, but you can find your way around it very easily. And I think they've done a very good job, actually, in what is undoubtedly the most complicated area of actually getting down to the fundamentals and setting things out in a clear way, which are actually useful to businesses. It's not just that it's telling them what they're required to do, it's actually useful to them in explaining clearly what they need to do, and which will benefit them.
Wonderful, thank you, Geoffrey. Jane, anything to add to finish off there?
The Technical Standards Committee, I can't remember if I mentioned it earlier, sorry, Kevin, they do maintain oversight of so not only the integrity programme of the certification body itself, but they also do maintain oversight of the auditor register of certification bodies, yes. And they have access if they want to have access to QA reports or look at the qualifications or competency or training records of particular auditors, they've actually got the right to have access to that information. So they're basically maintaining technical oversight in terms of the robustness of the scheme. They do that very, very thoroughly. So.
Wonderful, wonderful. Great. Thank you both for going through all of that. That's really, really useful information. And I'm sure there'll be some questions from the viewers in a little while. But for now, thank you very much. And let's bring in Selvarani, who's been waiting very patiently. Good morning. Thank you, Selvarani. So you chair the Impartiality Committee. How does the scheme ensure that the commercial interests or any prejudices by the certification body don't impact the audit side of Safe to Trade, and more importantly, the certification decisions themselves? Oh, sorry, you're just on mute. I shall just unmute you. Selvarani, you're going to need to unmute yourself. I'm just being told by a very helpful pop-up. There we go. Lovely. Thank you.
Screen back up. Is that okay now?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's perfect. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kelvin. Sorry about that. I hadn't realised I'd had myself on mute. No, it's a very important question and consideration. Obviously, for there to be trust in the process, these issues of potential bias need to be addressed. So the scheme itself requires that certification bodies have mechanisms in place to ensure fairness and neutrality in the certification process, avoiding any bias. Now, conflicts to impartiality and threats to impartiality are sources of potential conflicts of interest, bias and prejudice that could impact the objectivity of Safe to Trade certification, as we've said before. So if we using sort of Shield Safety as an example of a certification body, they have a separate policy on impartiality that requires all their auditors and anyone either directly or indirectly involved in the decision-making process around certification, for example, directors and managers, to sign impartiality declarations. So taking the auditor declaration as an example, this includes a requirement for them to declare if the person has had any prior involvement with the food business operator that they're going to audit. And if they do, they won't be allocated to audit that business for obvious reasons. They might act impartially, but I think it's just easier then if to remove them from that process, and they'll be allocated to a different business. The impartiality policy also requires Shield Safety to undertake an assessment of potential threats to impartiality and keep unidentified risks, all the identified risks under review in a register, which the Impartiality Committee will also review when they meet. In addition, all auditors are trained in impartiality and encouraged to report impartiality incidents, for example, threatening behaviour, inducements or bribery, or offers for bribery, and information on impartiality incidents will be recorded on by the auditor on the auditor form during the audit, which will then be captured by the certification body in their reporting process. All incidents will be reviewed by the certification body and action taken to address the issues encountered in line with the impartiality policy. An important factor, I think, is that the scheme doesn't set any requirements or targets for the certification body in terms of the number of businesses it needs to get on its approved register. So there's no onus on the auditors to meet certain targets, and I think that's a really important point to emphasise. And in addition to maintain oversight of these mechanisms, Shield Safety has established a certification body, Impartiality Committee, which I chair. It has representation from the certification body and the scheme owner and a number of very experienced external stakeholders. I think, Kelvin, we have a slide of the committee that we can show.
We do, yes.
There we go. So I won't go into all of the detail, but these people have, 25, 30 years experience in the food industry in various aspects. So I think they bring different aspects to the Impartiality Committee, both from sort of a regulatory point of view, academic point of view, and from the food industry itself. So I think a real asset to the scheme.
Wonderful. And Selvarani, for the benefit of those people who may be listening to this on the radio at all, are we able to just name drop those people that we've got on the committee to show the kind of diversity across the sector?
Yes, of course. So we've got Professor Declan Norton, who is a professor at Kingston University. We've got Professor Carol Wallace, who's a professor at Lancashire University. Sophie Lawrence, who is the manager of the Food Industry Intelligence Network. It's an industry information sharing platform that was set up after the Elliott Review and has at the moment 64 different food businesses that are signed up to that scheme. And Paul Turner, who's a very experienced environmental health officer and is involved in lots of initiatives like this. And then, of course, Kelvin and Jane, who are on this call also representing the certification body and the scheme.
Wonderful. Thank you, Selvarani. And obviously myself and Jane kind of bring the data with us to meetings for our expert panel to mull over and review. So thank you very much.
Just wanted to add that all members have to sign declarations and confidentiality agreements, and also undergo the same impartiality training as a certification body. Auditors are required to do so. So I think that they get an idea of what training the auditors have. So when we are assessing data, we can sort of see the context. In addition, the committee has endorsed the impartiality policy of the certification body, and we meet twice a year to review all of the impartiality issues encountered and the actions taken by the certification body to see if it's in line with the policy and if we agree with them.
Wonderful, thank you. Earlier you mentioned about the auditor declarations and any kind of relationships that they may have with the business to assume to make sure that they don't go and audit them. When we talk about relationships, what do we mean? Such as like they've previously worked for that organization?
Yeah, they could have supplied the organization if they have an own business previously, or they could have worked for them. But anything where they think there could be perceived to be a conflict of interest, even if there isn't one.
Yeah.
So I think it's just best for all parties in that case that they don't audit that particular business. There's plenty of other businesses, or we hope there will be, that they can be assigned to. So it's just easier then for people to be upfront that, even if it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago, to declare that, and then they can be assigned to a different food business.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's welcome Jane back to join us. Jane, we've talked a lot about the consistency and objectivity of the certification process. What kind of impartiality or controls do we have to make sure the safe to trade information is accurate, publicly accessible, and up to date?
I can say, myself, actually, some of the scheme management team actually sign impartiality declarations as well, although we're not, as I explained, from the way the scheme operates, we have no influence over what the certification decisions are against food businesses. But anyway, in terms of making sure that information is accurate and publicly available, publicly accessible, obviously we mentioned the Safe to Trade register that contains a list of food businesses that are approved against the standards. So the protocol states what must be displayed in that register. So we don't want to, it doesn't contain any kind of audit reports or non-conformance data. It purely states whether the business has met the standard or not, their name, their address, and then if consumers have provided feedback, that's publicly available as well from the register. It's important that the register is obviously maintained and kept up to date. The protocol states that the register must be updated daily by the certification body. So I know, Kelvin, you'll know, because you have experience of this, that there are lots and lots of transactions that are going on each day that then feed into updating the register on a daily basis. You might think that it's just the audit itself that determines the status of the business on the register, but actually there are lots of other attributes that impact their safe to trade status. So it can include things like their FHRS ratings. So if there's an audit, safe to trade audit has happened, the business goes onto the register, but then subsequently they get a poor FHRS rating. There's like a data warehouse that sits behind the register that picks up that information, sends a flag across to you, I think, Kelvin, that says, hang on a minute, this business has got a low FHRS rating. It needs to be investigated. And then I think, Kelvin, you would then arrange for an investigation to take place.
That's right. And I think it's important to point out as well, this isn't a human body kind of scanning both sets of data. It is a feed that comes in. So we're not manually monitoring hundreds and thousands of food businesses. If there is a drop in that food hygiene rating, the moment it appears on the FSA register, it will feed into Safe to Trade, provide the flag to me, and I will undertake a downgrade investigation, basically to place this business in review until the favourable food hygiene rating has been re-established, at which point they can then hopefully go back on the register.
Yeah, exactly. There could be other reasons as well and this is all stated in the protocol, where you may need to carry out a downgrade investigation. So it could be on the basis of poor consumer feedback, or it could be on the basis of something that has potential to bring the scheme into disrepute. There might be something about a business in the press that warrants an investigation. That's all defined. And I know, Kelvin, you're obviously all aware of what all those kind of triggers potentially are, in terms of making sure that the status of the businesses on the register is maintained and accurate, pulling information that comes from outside the scheme, as well as stuff that sits within the scheme itself. Also, in terms of maintaining accuracy of the register, I talked previously about the 30-day non-conformance closure timescale for food businesses. So that's all about trying to maintain the accuracy and the timeliness of the register information itself. But the protocol will also define what timescales the certification bodies have to deal with, for example, appeals or complaints or these downgrade investigations that we talked about. And typically there's a 7-day investigation period from something happening to the certification decision being reviewed. And all those investigation reports get fed through to the scheme. So when we're doing performance reviews with the Independence Governance Board and the Technical Standards Committee, they've got access to information that they can see to just maintain the robustness and maintain oversight of the robustness of the certification scheme.
Wonderful, thanks. And just going back to the impartiality aspects as well, my role as the certification body manager, it does sit very separately to the audit delivery. Therefore, any kind of downgrade investigations wouldn't be conducted by those people within the certification body who do have delivery targets and are involved in the actual assessment, appeals, customer complaints, etc., just to maintain that totally impartial aspect.
Yeah. Can I just add, Kelvin, as well? Just a point I forgot to mention. So in terms of information being publicly accessible, we talked about how the scheme shares information, or regulators can get a feed of data from the Safe to Trade register. The protocol defines very clearly what information can be shared with regulators. So it's typically what you see on the Safe to Trade register: business name, Safe to Trade status, that type of thing, quite high level. And then any non-conformance data that's shared is always anonymised and provided at a higher level in terms of kind of maybe geographical insights or insights by a particular business type, that type of thing. It's not done at a business specific level.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. We'll welcome Geoffrey back on as well, have all four of us on screen. Before we move on, Selvarani, have you got a comment?
Yeah, just one more thing about the Impartiality Committee. I mean, the scheme has its policy and we're hoping everything will go swimmingly. However, if the committee does have any concerns, it does have the power to sort of independently raise any issues with the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We're hoping we'll never have to do that, obviously, but it's nice that we have the power to do that if we do feel there are any issues. And I think that should reassure food business operators and regulators in terms of how seriously the certification body is taking impartiality.
Wonderful. Great point. Thank you, Selvarani. Geoffrey, are there any kind of data protection considerations that we need to consider about how the scheme shares data with regulators?
Yes, well, as I think we've already discussed, this is something which actually we have thought through very carefully, I think, because, and what I think comes out of it is, first of all, regulators actually would find it difficult to cope, and this has been shown in a survey, if they were to be given all the individual audit reports. Secondly, we have no desire to do this, and I'm sure food businesses don't either. We're not acting as the regulator. What matters to the regulator is whether businesses are still fully participating in the scheme, because that provides quite a level of assurance to them. So people, as others have said, don't have to worry about their audit reports going to their regulator. There's no need for this. It doesn't help. Conversely, as others have said, Jane was saying, what does come out of this is we may actually get very useful global data, so anonymized global data on particular trends and issues. And that would clearly be useful to regulators as to ourselves in running the scheme, in terms of knowing what to look out for where there seemed to be a general problem. But no, that people shouldn't, I think, worry at all about data protection. It is entirely taken care of by the scheme.
Wonderful. Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you all for your insights that we've provided today. I think it may be time now to look to some of the questions that have been sent in by the viewers. So we have a question here from Barry Trevina. Thank you for your question, Barry. How does the scheme align with the primary authority system? Who wants to take that? Is that one for you, Geoffrey, or Jane?
I mean, I can talk about it. So we have a primary authority coordinated partnership, so that the standard has assured advice. The certification body is also required to have assured advice on their audit set as well. So obviously the Safe to Trade registered data, which represents approved businesses, is in effect replicated through the regulated business group information that's shared on the primary authority website. So that data aligns. We actually think it may be easier for regulators and the public to access Safe to Trade's register to get that information rather than going through the primary authority website. But that's debatable anyway. We're also starting to look at whether the scheme has potential to operate as a national inspection plan, but that's very early days at this stage, so I don't want to kind of talk too much about that. That's maybe for a webinar in the future. Yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
Lovely, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Barry. Interesting question from Holly here in relation to the feedback aspect. So asking, is the field safety audit separate to the Safe to Trade audit? But more specifically, when feedback is provided, how does the food business operator see that feedback, and how can they respond to it? Because the Safe to Trade register is owned by us and what goes on it, isn't it, Jane?
Yeah. Shall I take that one again, unless anyone else wants to take it? Consumers can go to the Safe to Trade register when they can locate a food business on that, and that gives them the opportunity to provide feedback. So when they click on to provide feedback, they can give it a rating, they can provide some comments in terms of their feedback, and there's also some subcategories that they can rate the business on as well. That information, that automatically, if it's positive feedback or any feedback at all, the food business operator obviously has access to the register and they can see that feedback. If it's negative feedback, so a negative rating, then that automatically triggers a notification through to the certification body, who then will conduct an investigation with the food business operator about the feedback. And as part of that investigation process, the food business operator does have the right to apply on the register itself. So there is a feedback mechanism for food business operators, but it's generally just used for negative feedback at this stage.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. And just to point out, we are very sensitive and aware that there are things like malicious feedback that could be entered onto public domains, in this day of TripAdvisor that we live. So we're very much aware that feedback needs to be consistent and, proportionate in order to trigger any action being taken, but it's always done in association with the food business operator and evidence-based as well. So I just thought I'd add that in. But thank you, Holly, for your question.
Can I just mention, Kelvin, actually, sorry, because it's kind of valid. I didn't mention earlier, but the standard itself covers allergens, which differentiates itself from FHRS, for example, which doesn't. So allergen information, declarations in terms of whether food's kind of gluten-free, that type of thing is all covered through the standard itself. So when consumers are giving feedback, they can give feedback around those types of issues as well, not just what would traditionally be covered through the FHRS rating.
Wonderful, good point. Thank you, Jane. And for anyone who's particularly interested in the allergen content of Safe to Trade, if you take a look at last month's webinar that we run during Allergy Awareness Week, we did a full 1 hour topic on allergen management. Okay, another question here, AFM Buyan. So no food business operator would be able to apply before getting a food hygiene rating? That's a very good question. Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to answer it again.
They're all the level of detail in the protocol, so you're getting a dash in here, but it's all good stuff.
It's actually something we've recently changed in the protocol because we noticed that some businesses were waiting for their FHRS assessment, and it seemed really unfair that they weren't allowed to meet the Safe to Trade standard on that basis. So the protocol has actually just very recently been updated to allow businesses who are still awaiting assessment for FHRS to be approved. Obviously, if subsequent to their Safe to Trade audit, they then had a poor FHRS rating, that approval status would be reviewed. And it's likely that the business could be downgraded, but no, that's not, that doesn't, not having an FHRS rating doesn't preclude a business from joining the scheme. And that also means, for example, if you take a multi-location operator that might have businesses in the Republic of Ireland, if they want all their businesses to meet the Safe to Trade standard, which is actually mainly UK legislation based, then they can do that. And because the FHRS rating doesn't exist in Republic of Ireland, those locations can still achieve the Safe to Trade standard.
But rest assured as well, what we were saying about the link in with the FSA database, if those premises awaiting inspection achieve Safe to Trade approval and are then inspected and it's a 0, 1 or 2 or a improvement required in Scotland, that would then trigger an immediate downgrade investigation from us. So it's almost a provisional yes until we know for sure. Geoffrey?
Yeah, I mean, I just was going to say how much I agree with this change that we've made. It clearly is wrong that people can't get into the scheme for reasons which are beyond their control. Equally, although no doubt, as always, there'll be an exception to the rule, there is something very odd about a business which actually fails its FHRS, but has actually met all the requirements that we have. So, I think if we found to any extent this was happening, we'd have to look into exactly what was going on. But for the moment, I think it's absolutely the right move. And certainly if Irish businesses want to join in, obviously they don't have the FHRS, but it would nevertheless, I think, be a very good thing for them to do.
As many multi-location businesses of Shield Safety do, you wouldn't want to exclude any businesses in the devolved nations or in ROI there. Wonderful. We're coming up to time. I think we have exhausted our questions there. If any of the viewers do have any questions and you've not yet typed them in, please feel free to put any messages in the comments from when this is published in the forums, and a member of our team will pick up and follow up on those. But Geoffrey, Selvarani, Jane, thank you very much for your time this morning, providing your insight and joining us. Thank you to everyone who has watched us live today. Thank you to those who are listening on catch up, and we hope that you'll join us next month for another Safe to Trade conversation. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelvin.
Okay.